I was sent under my sister's name. Even now, as I look back on that journey, I can still feel the weight of those words my father spoke in our dimly lit parlor. Our family's honor depends on you, Clara. His voice was stern, final, as though he were pronouncing a sentence rather than making a request. My mother said nothing. She simply folded my dresses with trembling hands and tucked them into the worn leather trunk that had once belonged to my grandmother. The man in Montana had paid for a bride named Lydia Whitford. He had exchanged letters with my sister for months, pouring his hopes onto paper, describing the wide skies and endless plains of his ranch. He had fallen in love with her elegant handwriting, her carefully chosen words, her promises of devotion. But the woman who would step off that train in the dust and heat of a Montana afternoon would not be Lydia. It would be me. My sister had refused to go. She had found a banker's son in Boston, someone who could offer her society dinners and silk gowns and a life far removed from the frontier. And so I was chosen to take her place. Not because I was wanted, not because I was loved, but because I was expendable. As the train carried me farther and farther west, something strange began to happen. With every mile that passed, with every town we left behind, I felt the name Clara return to life inside me. For so long I had lived in Lydia's shadow, the plain sister, the one who was never quite enough. But out here, beyond the reach of parlors and expectations, I began to wonder if perhaps I could become someone new, someone real. And when I finally met him on that dusty platform, when I looked into the eyes of Cole Remington and saw the flicker of disappointment cross his weathered face, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Not for him. Not for me. This was the beginning of something I could not yet name, but I could feel it stirring in my heart like the first breath of spring after a long, cold winter.
Every story deserves to be heard. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Your voice keeps the past alive.
The train station in Benton, Montana was little more than a weathered platform and a faded sign swinging in the prairie wind. When Clara Whitford stepped down from the passenger car, her modest blue traveling dress already dusted with the fine grit of the journey, she carried only a single trunk and a heart full of apprehension. Cole Remington stood waiting at the far end of the platform, his tall frame silhouetted against the vast Montana sky. He was older than she had imagined, perhaps 35, with lines carved into his face by sun and hardship. His dark hair was touched with premature gray at the temples, and his eyes held a wariness that spoke of battles fought and losses endured. He had fought in the war, she knew from the letters, though he had never spoken of what he had seen there. As Clara approached, pulling her trunk behind her with effort, she watched his expression shift. He had been expecting Lydia, beautiful Lydia with her golden hair and refined features. What he saw instead was a woman of ordinary appearance, with earnest brown eyes and capable hands, her dark hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck. The disappointment in his gaze was unmistakable, though he tried with rough courtesy to hide it. "Miss Whitford." His voice was low, gravelly from disuse. "Yes," Clara replied, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster. "Mr. Remington, I presume." He nodded once, then reached for her trunk without another word. They walked in silence to his wagon, a simple farm vehicle pulled by two tired-looking horses. The town of Benton spread out around them, a collection of wooden buildings baking under the relentless sun. Clara could feel the curious stares of the townspeople as they passed, could hear the whispered speculation. The ride to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, and neither of them spoke. Clara watched the landscape unfold around her, the rolling grasslands stretching endlessly toward distant mountains. It was beautiful in its stark simplicity, so different from the crowded streets and manicured gardens of Boston. Here, the sky seemed to touch the earth at every horizon, and the silence was profound. The ranch itself was modest, a simple wooden house with a sagging porch and windows that needed repair. Outbuildings dotted the property, and a few cattle grazed in distant pastures. It was clear that Cole Remington worked this land alone, that he struggled to maintain what had once, perhaps, been a more prosperous operation. "We'll be married tomorrow," Cole said as he helped her down from the wagon. "The circuit preacher is in town. After that you'll have your own room. I don't expect anything you're not willing to give." His words, though gruff, held a kind of respect that surprised her. Clara nodded, grateful for this small mercy. The wedding took place the following afternoon in the town's small church, a barn-like structure that smelled of hay and old wood. There were no guests, no flowers, no celebration. The preacher, an elderly man with kind eyes, spoke the traditional vows while Cole and Clara stood side by side, two strangers binding their lives together out of necessity rather than love. When it was done, when they had spoken their promises before God and signed the register, they returned to the ranch in the same silence that had marked their journey the day before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Clara felt the weight of her new reality settling upon her shoulders. That night, alone in the small bedroom Cole had prepared for her, Clara knelt beside the narrow iron bed and pressed her hands together in prayer. The room was spare but clean, with a single window overlooking the dark prairie. She could hear the wind moving through the grass, a sound both lonely and strangely comforting. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "I may have begun with a lie, but I'll live with the truth. Help me to be worthy of this second chance. Help me to make something good from this deception." It was the first seed of courage, small and fragile but real. As she climbed into bed and pulled the thin quilt over her shoulders, Clara felt something shift inside her. She was no longer living someone else's story. This was hers now, for better or worse. And she would face whatever came with whatever strength she could find. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, filling the vast Montana sky with points of light. And in the house that had been silent for so long, the sound of another person breathing, living, hoping, began to change the very air itself. The days that followed established a careful rhythm between Cole and Clara, a dance of polite distance and unspoken boundaries. Each morning, Clara rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, laying out simple fare of biscuits, gravy, and strong coffee. Cole would eat quickly, nod his thanks, and disappear into the fields or the barn, returning only when the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. But while Cole worked the land, Clara set about transforming the house. It was not that she sought to impose herself upon his space, but rather that she could not help but see what needed doing, and her hands itched to make things right. The windows, she discovered, had not been properly cleaned in years. She mixed vinegar and water, climbing onto chairs to reach the higher panes, scrubbing until the glass sparkled and the rooms filled with clean Montana sunlight. The difference was startling. What had been a dim, cave-like interior suddenly became a home where one could see and breathe. She found seeds in the barn, packets that had been purchased but never planted, and she worked the hard earth by the front porch until she could press them into the soil. Within days, tiny green shoots began to emerge, promises of color to come. Clara watered them each morning and evening, talking to them softly as she had seen her grandmother do. The kitchen became her domain. She organized the pantry, discovering supplies that had gone unused, and she began to bake. Bread was first, the yeasty smell filling the house and drifting out across the yard. Then pies made from preserved fruit she found in the cellar, and cookies that she left on a plate on the table, hoping Cole might take one. He did, though he never said so. But she noticed the plate was always empty by morning. Slowly, methodically, Clara restored order to the lonely house. She mended curtains, swept corners that had gathered years of dust, and polished the old furniture until the wood grain showed through. She found a rocking chair in one of the outbuildings, dragged it onto the porch, and repaired its broken runner. In the evenings, she would sit there and watch the sunset, her hands busy with mending or knitting. Cole watched all of this from a distance, saying little, but Clara could feel his attention. Sometimes she would look up from her work to find him standing in a doorway, observing her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he would turn away and return to his own tasks. It was during the 3rd week of their marriage that Hattie Rose Coldwell came to call. Hattie was the nearest neighbor, living 5 miles to the east with her husband and 4 children. She was a stout, practical woman with laugh lines around her eyes and flour permanently dusted across her apron. "Well now," Hattie said as Clara welcomed her onto the porch, "I had to come see for myself what everyone in town is gossiping about. Cole Remington's mail-order bride." Her eyes were sharp but not unkind as they took in Clara's appearance. Clara offered her lemonade, and the two women sat in the shade of the porch, the repaired rocking chair creaking gently as Hattie settled her weight into it. "You've done wonders with this place," Hattie observed, looking around. "I haven't seen flowers by this porch since Cole's mother passed. Must be 10 years ago now." "It needed tending," Clara said simply. Hattie studied her for a long moment, then smiled with something that looked like approval. "That man learned how to survive, not how to live," she said, her voice taking on a knowing quality. "After the war, after his parents died, after his brother never came home from the fighting, Cole just sort of shut down. He keeps the ranch going, but he stopped seeing the point of beauty, of comfort, of anything beyond the next day's work." Clara listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "Maybe you can teach him the rest," Hattie continued, reaching over to pat Clara's hand. "Maybe you can remind him what it means to have a home instead of just a house." After Hattie left, promising to return soon with her children in tow, Clara sat alone on the porch and let those words sink deep into her heart. She thought about the letters Lydia had written, full of empty promises and borrowed sentiments. She thought about the deception that had brought her here, and the fear that Cole would discover the truth and send her away. But she also thought about the bread rising in the kitchen, about the flowers pushing up through the hard earth, about the way the sunlight now filled the rooms where before there had been only shadow. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Clara realized something profound. She was no longer living in her sister's shadow. She was not here because of Lydia's beauty or Lydia's words. She was here because she had chosen to come, because she had the courage to step onto that train and into an unknown life. And day by day, task by task, she was building something real. That evening, when Cole came in for supper, he paused in the doorway and looked around the kitchen as though seeing it for the first time. The table was set with care, candles lit against the gathering dusk, fresh bread steaming on a plate. "It's different," he said finally. Clara, stirring a pot at the stove, glanced over her shoulder. "Is that all right?" He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he nodded, just once, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's all right." They ate together in the candlelight, and though few words passed between them, the silence was no longer quite so heavy. Outside, the wind moved through Clara's young flowers, and inside, the house seemed to breathe a little deeper, a little fuller, as though waking from a long sleep. The storm came without warning, as storms often do on the Montana plains. One moment the evening sky was clear, tinged with the pink and gold of sunset, and the next dark clouds were boiling up from the northwest, moving with terrifying speed across the grasslands. Clara was in the kitchen, putting away the supper dishes, when she heard the first rumble of thunder. It was so deep and powerful that the windows rattled in their frames. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch, where Cole already stood, his eyes fixed on the approaching darkness. "Get inside," he said without looking at her. "This is going to be bad." Within minutes, the wind arrived, bending the prairie grass nearly flat and tearing at the roof shingles. Rain followed, not in drops but in sheets, turning the world gray and obscure. Lightning split the sky, and the thunder that followed shook the very foundations of the house. Clara moved through the rooms, closing shutters and placing buckets under the leaks that immediately appeared in the ceiling. Cole was outside, securing the barn doors and checking on the livestock. She could see his dark form moving through the rain, hunched against the wind. They had just settled inside, both of them soaked through, when they heard the frantic pounding on the door. Cole opened it to reveal Samuel Garrett, a neighboring rancher, his face streaming with rain and pale with fear. "It's Eli," Samuel shouted over the roar of the storm. "My boy. He went out to bring in the goats before the storm hit and he hasn't come back. The creek, it's flooding." I've checked everywhere near the house but I can't find him. I need help. Cole didn't hesitate. He was already moving toward the door, reaching for his rain slicker. I'll saddle up, he said. Clara felt her heart seize with fear, not just for the missing child but for Cole, who would ride out into this chaos. She knew about Eli Garrett, a bright-eyed boy of 8 who had waved to her from his father's wagon when they'd passed on the road just last week. I'm going, Cole said, pulling on his boots. Clara grabbed her own coat from the peg by the door. Then I'm going with you. Cole turned to stare at her, rain dripping from his hair. Absolutely not. This is dangerous. That child is out there, Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. You'll need every pair of eyes, every pair of hands you can get. I'm going. For a moment, Cole looked as though he would argue, but something in Clara's expression must have convinced him. He gave a sharp nod, then led the way to the barn. The horses were terrified by the storm, but Cole and Samuel quickly saddled 3 of them. Clara had never ridden in such conditions, had rarely ridden at all, but she pulled herself up into the saddle with determination and gripped the reins with white-knuckled hands. They rode out into the storm, following the path toward the creek that ran between the properties. The rain was blinding, and several times Clara nearly lost her seat as her horse stumbled over unseen obstacles. She could barely make out Cole's form ahead of her, could only follow the dark shape of his back and trust that he knew where they were going. The creek, normally a gentle, shallow stream, had become a raging torrent. The water had risen far beyond its banks, carrying debris and churning with dangerous currents. They rode along its edge, calling Eli's name, their voices lost in the wind and rain. It was Clara who spotted him first. A flash of red, Eli's shirt, visible for just a moment downstream where the creek passed under an old wooden bridge. The bridge had partially collapsed under the force of the water, and the boy was trapped beneath it, clinging to a broken beam with the water rushing around him. There! Clara shouted, pointing. Cole saw it too and spurred his horse forward, but even as they approached, they could see the danger. The bridge was unstable, the beam Eli clung to already beginning to crack under the pressure of the current. One wrong move and the entire structure could collapse, taking the child with it. Cole dismounted and began to work his way out onto what remained of the bridge, testing each plank before putting his weight on it. But the current was too strong, the approach too treacherous. He looked back at Clara and Samuel, frustration and fear clear on his face. That was when Clara made her decision. She slid from her horse and ran to the edge of the water, not to the bridge but to a point downstream where the bank was lower. If the beam broke, if Eli lost his grip, the current would carry him this way. Clara, no. Cole's voice cut through the storm, but she was already wading in. The cold water was a shock, stealing her breath and immediately dragging at her skirts. She pushed forward, finding her footing on the rocky bottom, moving deeper until the water was at her waist, then her chest. She positioned herself downstream from Eli, bracing herself against a partially submerged boulder. Above her, Cole had nearly reached the boy. She could see him extending his hand, could see Eli trying to reach for it. But the beam gave way with a crack that was audible even over the storm, and suddenly the child was in the water, his small body tumbling in the current. Clara didn't think. She launched herself toward him, her hands reaching, closing around fabric, around a thin arm. She pulled him to her chest, fighting to keep both their heads above water as the current tried to drag them downstream. Her feet lost their purchase on the bottom, and they were swept several yards before she managed to grab onto a low-hanging branch. Then Cole was there, wading in from the side, his strong arms closing around both of them. Together they fought their way back to the bank, where Samuel pulled them up onto solid ground. Eli was coughing up water but alive, and his father wrapped him in his coat, tears of relief streaming down his face. Clara collapsed onto her hands and knees, gasping for air, her entire body shaking with cold and exhaustion and the aftermath of terror. Cole knelt beside her, his hand on her back. "Are you all right?" His voice was rough with emotion. Clara nodded, unable to speak. She looked up at him through the rain streaming down her face and saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not disappointment, not distance. Something warmer. Something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she was afraid to name. They rode back to the Garrett ranch together, where Sarah Garrett tearfully thanked them while bundling Eli into warm blankets. Then Cole and Clara made the journey home through the still raging storm, riding side by side, not speaking but somehow closer than they had ever been. When they finally reached their own barn and had seen to the horses, they stumbled into the house, both of them dripping and exhausted. Clara's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely stand, and her legs threatened to give out beneath her. Cole caught her as she swayed, lifting her into his arms without a word. He carried her to the kitchen and set her gently in a chair, then built up the fire in the stove until warmth began to fill the room. He brought her blankets and dry clothes, then turned his back while she changed, her fingers so numb she could barely manage the buttons. When she was dry and wrapped in quilts, Cole finally spoke. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly. "And the most foolish." Clara looked at him, at this man who had ridden into a flood to save a neighbor's child, who had nearly lost his own life in the process, and she felt something crack open in her chest. "I couldn't let him die," she said simply. Cole met her eyes, and in that moment, something passed between them, some understanding that went beyond words. Trust, perhaps, or the first tender shoots of something deeper. "Neither could I," he said. They sat together by the fire as the storm raged outside, two people who had been strangers now bound by shared danger and shared purpose. And in that desperate moment, in the cold and the dark and the aftermath of fear, something real had taken root between them. Something that, given time and care, might grow into love. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through her window and a fever burning through her body. Her throat was raw, her chest ached with every breath, and when she tried to sit up, the room spun sickeningly around her. She fell back against the pillows with a soft moan, her skin alternately burning and shivering with chills. She must have made some sound, or perhaps Cole had simply been checking on her, because within moments he was there in the doorway, his weathered face creasing with concern. "You're ill," he said, stating the obvious as he crossed the room and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such rough hands. "You're burning up." "I'm fine," Clara tried to say, but her voice came out as little more than a croak, and the effort of speaking triggered a coughing fit that left her gasping. "You're not fine," Cole said firmly. He disappeared and returned moments later with cool water and clean cloths. "You're staying in bed. No arguments." For the next 3 days, Clara drifted in and out of feverish sleep while Cole tended to her with a care that surprised them both. He brought her broth when she could take it, changed the cool compresses on her forehead, and sat beside her bed during the worst of the fever. His quiet presence a comfort in her delirium. Once, waking in the middle of the night, Clara found him dozing in the chair beside her bed. His head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle, his hand resting near hers on the quilt. The lamp was turned low, casting shadows across his face, and she studied him in the dim light, this stranger who had become her husband, who was now caring for her with such unexpected tenderness. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Clara woke to find her mind clear, her body weak but no longer burning. The sun was just rising, painting the room in shades of rose and gold, and Cole was there again, sitting in the chair, watching her with tired eyes. "You're better," he said, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable. "Thanks to you," Clara whispered. Cole shook his head. "You nearly died from the cold and the water. All because of Eli." He paused, his jaw working as though struggling with words he wasn't sure how to say. Finally he continued, his voice low and rough with emotion. "Lydia would never have done what you did." Clara's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her sister's name, at the reminder of the deception that lay between them. But Cole wasn't finished. "The woman in those letters," he said, "she wrote beautiful words about devotion and partnership, about sharing a life on the frontier. But they were just words. When I saw you go into that water, When I saw you risk your life for a neighbor's child without hesitation, I realized something." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving her face. "Whatever else you might be, whoever else you might be, you're real. Your actions are real. And that means more than all the pretty letters in the world." It wasn't criticism in his voice. It was awe. And perhaps, Clara thought with a flutter in her chest, the beginning of something more. "I need to tell you something," Clara began, her voice still weak but determined. Now was the time for truth, while they were both raw and honest with each other. But Cole raised a hand, stopping her. "Not now," he said gently. "You need to rest to get your strength back. Whatever you need to tell me, it can wait until you're well." He stood and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to let in the full morning light. Outside, the storm had passed completely, and the world looked washed clean. The prairie grass sparkled with moisture, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The flowers Clara had planted by the porch had survived the deluge and were beginning to open their first blooms, small spots of color against the weathered wood. "Do you see that?" Cole asked, gesturing toward the window. "After a storm like that, everything dies or everything grows stronger. There's no in-between." Clara struggled to sit up, and Cole hurried to help her, adjusting the pillows behind her back so she could see out the window. Together they looked at the dawn spilling gold across the hills, at the landscape reborn after the violence of the storm. "We're still here," Clara said softly. "We survived." "We did," Cole agreed. And then, in a gesture that took Clara's breath away, he reached down and took her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "We did it together." They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. It was a symbol, Clara thought, of rebirth for them both. They had weathered the storm, not just the one that had torn across the plains, but the storm of circumstance and deception and mutual disappointment that had marked their first weeks together. And now, in the light of dawn, they were beginning again. Over the following days, as Clara regained her strength, a new pattern emerged between them. Cole was less distant, more likely to linger over breakfast, to share small observations about the ranch or the weather. Clara, for her part, felt the constant weight of her secret growing heavier, but she also felt the growing connection between them, fragile as new grass but real. They worked together to repair the damage from the storm, mending fences and clearing debris. Cole showed her how to check the cattle, and Clara showed him the herb garden she was planning, explaining which plants would help with common ailments, knowledge passed down from her grandmother. News came from the Garrett ranch that Eli was fully recovered and asking when he could come thank the brave lady who had saved him. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes at the message, and when she looked up, she found Cole watching her with an expression of such warmth that her breath caught. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. "You've changed me." And Clara knew, with both joy and terror, that the time for truth was fast approaching. She could not build a real future on a foundation of lies, no matter how much she might want to. Whatever came next, whatever consequences she might face, she owed Cole honesty. But for now, in this golden morning light, with his hand warm in hers and hope blooming like her flowers in the front yard, she allowed herself this moment of peace. The storm had passed. The sun had risen. And they were, against all odds, still standing. Together. The confession came on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the storm, when the last light of day was fading from the western sky. Clara had prepared a special dinner, roasted chicken with vegetables from the garden she'd started, fresh bread, and even a pie made from wild berries she'd gathered on the prairie. It was a feast by their usual standards, and Cole had looked surprised and pleased when he came in from the fields to find the table set with such care. They ate together, making small talk about the ranch, about the neighbors, about everything except what weighed most heavily on Clara's heart. But as Cole pushed his empty plate away and leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh, Clara knew she could not delay any longer. "Cole," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you from the beginning." He must have heard the tremor in her voice, the fear, because his expression grew serious and he leaned forward, giving her his full attention. "All right," he said quietly. "I'm listening." Clara took a deep breath, her hands twisted together in her lap beneath the table. "I'm not Lydia," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "My name is Clara. Clara Whitford. Lydia is my sister, my older sister. She's the one who wrote those letters to you, who promised to come here and be your wife. But at the last minute she refused. She had met someone else, someone with more money and better prospects, and she didn't want to come to Montana. She forced herself to look up to meet Cole's eyes, expecting to see anger there or betrayal. But his face was carefully neutral, his gaze steady as he waited for her to continue. "My father," Clara went on, her voice breaking slightly. "He had already spent the money you sent for the bride's passage. Our family was in debt, and we couldn't return it, so he sent me instead. He told me to keep silent, to let you believe I was Lydia, and that eventually you would never know the difference." A bitter laugh escaped her. "As if anyone could ever mistake me for my beautiful sister." She looked down at her hands, unable to bear the weight of his gaze any longer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for the deception. You paid for a bride, for someone who wrote you those letters, and instead you got me, plain Clara who has never written a beautiful sentence in her life. I understand if you want me to leave. I understand if you hate me." The silence that followed was so profound that Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. She waited for Cole's anger, for his condemnation, for the words that would send her away from this place that had, impossibly, begun to feel like home. Instead, she heard the scrape of his chair as he stood. She heard his footsteps crossing the room. And then she felt his presence beside her as he knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "Clara," he said, and the way he spoke her true name with such gentleness made tears spring to her eyes. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly, expecting to see disappointment or disgust. But what she saw instead was something far more complicated. A mixture of understanding and resignation, and something that might have been relief. "I knew," Cole said simply. Clara stared at him, not comprehending. "You knew." "Not at first," Cole clarified. "But within the first few days. The woman in those letters wrote about loving the theater, about playing piano, about her hopes for hosting elegant dinner parties even on the frontier. And then you arrived, and you were quiet and practical. And you set about fixing windows and planting gardens like someone who had worked with her hands all her life. The pieces didn't fit." He stood and crossed to the fireplace, where he opened a small wooden box on the mantel. From it, he withdrew a partially burned envelope, the edges charred but the handwriting still visible. He brought it back to Clara and placed it gently on the table before her. "I found this," he said, "in the things you unpacked that first week. It had fallen behind your trunk. It was a letter addressed to Lydia Whitford, from some banker's son in Boston, full of talk about their upcoming wedding." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She had thought she had been so careful, had thought she had left all evidence of her deception behind. But one letter, one carelessly dropped envelope, had given her away. "Why didn't you say anything?" she whispered. Cole returned to his chair and sat heavily, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped before him. "At first I was angry," he admitted. "I felt cheated, lied to. I had paid for a bride and received an impostor. But then I watched you, Clara. I watched you work from dawn to dusk making this house into a home. I watched you treat my horse's injured leg with patience and skill. I watched you sit on the porch in the evenings and look at this land with wonder instead of disappointment. And I began to realize something." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I may have written to the wrong name," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But God sent me the right woman." A sob escaped Clara before she could stop it, and tears began to stream down her face. "How can you say that?" she asked. "I lied to you. I deceived you from the very first moment." "Did you?" Cole challenged gently. "Or did you accept an impossible situation with courage and dignity?" Did you come here knowing you would be compared to someone more beautiful, more refined, and choose to make the best of it anyway? That's not deception, Clara. That's bravery. He reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture now familiar between them but no less powerful for its repetition. The woman who wrote those letters, she made promises she never intended to keep. But you've kept promises you never made. You've been a true partner to me in ways I never expected, never dared to hope for. Clara wiped at her tears with her free hand, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I don't understand, she said. You're not angry. Oh, I was angry, Cole said with a slight smile. At your father for putting you in this position. At Lydia, for her selfishness and cowardice. Even at you a little for going along with it. But Clara, anger fades. And what remains is this. You risked your life for Eli. You've brought light and life back to this house. You've given me a reason to care about something beyond just surviving another day. How could I be angry about that? They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of deception finally lifted, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like the beginning of real trust. I want to start over, Cole said finally. Not as Cole and Lydia, but as Cole and Clara. As two people who choose each other honestly, with all our flaws and fears out in the open. Clara felt her heart swell with an emotion so powerful it almost hurt. I would like that, she whispered. I would like that very much. That evening they shared dinner together in a way they never had before. Not as strangers bound by duty and deception, but as two souls who had survived storms both literal and metaphorical, who had tested each other and found something worth keeping. They talked late into the night, really talked, sharing stories from their pasts, their hopes for the future, the small details that make up a life. Clara told him about growing up in her sister's shadow, about always being the practical one, the plain one, the one nobody noticed. Cole told her about the war, about the horrors he had seen and the men he had lost, about coming home to find his parents dead and his brother's grave already cold in the ground. I stopped believing in beauty, Cole said quietly as they sat together on the porch under the stars. I stopped believing in anything except survival. And then you came, and you planted flowers. Clara smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. They're just flowers. No, Cole said, shaking his head. They're hope. They're the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. That's what you've given me, Clara. Not just a clean house or good food or even your courage. You've given me hope. As the night deepened around them and the prairie sang its ancient song of wind and grass, Clara felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like peace. The truth was out. The lies were behind them. And whatever came next, they would face it together, as themselves, with nothing hidden between them. For the first time since leaving Boston, Clara felt truly free. She was no longer living Lydia's life, no longer hiding behind someone else's name. She was simply Clara, and that was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, exactly what both of them needed. The carriage arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks after Clara's confession, pulling up to the ranch house in a cloud of dust and pretension. It was a fine vehicle, far too elegant for the rough Montana roads, drawn by 2 matching horses and driven by a man in formal livery. And stepping down from it, dressed in silk the color of cream and wearing a hat decorated with ostrich feathers, was Lydia Whitford. Clara saw her first, having been in the garden pulling weeds from around her now flourishing flowers. She straightened slowly, her heart dropping into her stomach as she watched her sister survey the ranch with barely concealed disdain. Lydia had always been beautiful, but wealth and city living had polished that beauty to a hard, glittering shine. She looked like a diamond placed carelessly among stones. "Clara," Lydia called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescension Clara knew so well. "So this is where you've been hiding. How quaint." Cole emerged from the barn, alerted by the sound of horses and voices. He took one look at Lydia, then at Clara's pale face, and his jaw tightened. Without a word, he crossed the yard to stand beside his wife, his presence solid and reassuring. "I assume you're Lydia," he said, his voice carefully neutral. And you must be Mr. Remington, Lydia replied, looking him up and down with an appraising eye that made Clara's stomach turn. Though I see the letters perhaps overstated certain aspects of your situation. Her gaze swept over the modest ranch house, the simple outbuildings, the practical functionality of it all. What are you doing here? Clara asked, finding her voice at last. Lydia smiled, but it was not a kind expression. I've come to correct a terrible mistake, she announced. You see, my engagement to Mr. Harrison fell through. He turned out to be far less wealthy than he appeared, and certain debts came to light that made the match inadvisable. Father suggested I might take up my original arrangement after all. She took a step toward Cole, her smile becoming coy. I am, after all, the woman you were corresponding with, the woman you paid for. And I'm prepared to honor that agreement now, if you'll send my sister back where she belongs. The audacity of it left Clara speechless. But Cole, she noticed, looked more angry than she had ever seen him. A muscle worked in his jaw, and his hands clenched at his sides. Let me make sure I understand, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You refused to come when you promised. You sent your sister in your place without informing me, putting her in a position of deception and danger. You abandoned the commitment you made because you thought you'd found something better. And now that your better option has failed, you expect to simply step back into an arrangement you've treated with nothing but contempt. Lydia blinked, apparently unused to being spoken to in such a manner. Well, that is to say, I am legally the intended bride. The contracts were in my name. Contracts, Cole repeated, and he laughed, though there was no humor in it. You think this is about contracts? About legal names on paper? He turned to Clara, and his expression softened. Tell me, Clara, in the past 3 months, have you ever once treated our marriage as a contract? Clara shook her head, tears threatening but refusing to fall. No, she said softly. Never. Cole turned back to Lydia, and his voice was hard as stone. You were the woman from the letters, he said. I won't deny that. You wrote beautiful words about devotion and partnership, about building a life together. But she, he gestured to Clara, she is the woman in my life. She is the one who made those words real. She is the one who works beside me, who risks herself for our neighbors, who has made this house a home. Paper and ink mean nothing compared to that. Lydia's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger and humiliation. You would choose her over me, she demanded. Plain Clara, who has never turned a head in her life, who has no accomplishments, no refinements. I am everything she is not. Exactly, Cole said quietly. You are everything she is not. And I thank God for that every single day. The words hung in the air, final and absolute. Lydia stared at him, then at Clara, her face working through a series of emotions. Shock, outrage, and finally, a bitter understanding. You'll regret this, she said, her voice shaking. When the harvest fails, when the winters grow hard, when you realize what you've given up for a woman who can barely write a proper sentence, you'll regret it. The only regret I have, Cole said, is that I ever wrote to you in the first place. But that mistake brought me Clara, so perhaps even my worst decisions led to my greatest blessing. Lydia stood there for a moment longer, her beauty somehow diminished by her anger and wounded pride. Then she turned on her heel and climbed back into her carriage, snapping at the driver to take her back to town. They watched as the elegant vehicle pulled away, leaving a trail of dust that slowly settled back to the earth. When it was gone, when they could no longer hear the sound of hoofbeats, Clara found she was trembling. The confrontation, the fear of losing everything she had built, the shock of seeing her sister again after all these months, it all crashed over her at once. Cole turned to her, his hands gentle as they came up to frame her face. Are you all right? He asked. She's gone, Clara whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. She came to take you back, and you sent her away. Clara, Cole said, and there was something in his voice that made her breath catch. I didn't send her away for you. I sent her away because of you. Because you are not a substitute or a replacement or second best. You are the choice I would make every single time. The tears came then, but they were tears of relief, of joy, of something that felt very much like love. Cole pulled her into his arms, and Clara let herself lean against his solid strength, let herself believe what he had said. For the first time in her entire life, Clara realized she was not standing in anyone's shadow. She was not being compared and found wanting, not being overlooked for someone lovelier or more refined. She was being chosen, deliberately and completely, for exactly who she was. When she finally pulled back to look up at Cole's face, she saw her own emotions reflected there. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could think about them, but feeling absolutely right. "I think I've loved you since the storm, since you sat beside my bed when I was ill, since you first called me by my real name. I love you, Cole Remington." His smile, when it came, transformed his whole face, erasing years of sorrow and loneliness. "I love you too, Clara," he said. "My brave, honest, beautiful Clara. I have for weeks now, but I didn't know if you could ever feel the same, knowing how this all started." "How it started doesn't matter," Clara said fiercely. "What matters is what we've built, what we've become. Together." He kissed her then, there in the yard with the sun warm on their faces and the prairie wind singing around them, and it was the kiss of two people who had found each other through the most unlikely of circumstances and chosen, against all odds, to make something real and lasting. When they finally pulled apart, both of them a little breathless and a lot happier than they had been mere minutes ago, Clara looked around at the ranch, at the house with its repaired windows and blooming flowers, at the land stretching endlessly toward the mountains. "This is home," she said softly. "Yes," Cole agreed, his arm around her waist, solid and sure. "It is." And for the first time since that train had carried her west into uncertainty, Clara breathed freely. She was no longer a substitute, no longer living a borrowed life. She was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. The shadow of Lydia's beauty, of her parents' disappointment, of all those years of being second best, had finally lifted. And in its place was sunlight, warm and golden and full of promise. The drought came slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A few days without rain stretched into a week, then 2, then a month. The vibrant green of early summer faded to yellow, then to brown. The creek that had nearly killed them during the storm dwindled to a trickle, then to isolated pools, then to nothing but cracked mud. Clara watched her garden struggle and fought to save what she could, carrying water from the well bucket by bucket. But the well itself was dropping, the rope needing to go deeper each day to reach water. The cattle grew thin, wandering farther in search of grazing, and Cole's face became lined with worry he tried to hide. Other ranches were suffering too. At church on Sundays, the congregation prayed for rain, their voices growing more desperate as the weeks passed. Neighbors who had been friendly grew suspicious and territorial about water rights. Small disputes became larger conflicts. And through it all, the sun beat down relentlessly from a cloudless sky. It was during this season of hardship that the whispers began. Clara first heard them at the general store in town, when she thought she was alone in the back aisle. Two women's voices, low but carrying. "They say she's not really his wife, you know. Not the one he sent for." "I heard that too. Apparently, she deceived him, tricked him into marriage. And now look what's happened. Worst drought anyone can remember. Maybe it's a curse. Maybe God is punishing them for starting their marriage with lies." Clara had stood frozen, a bag of flour clutched in her hands, shame burning through her. She knew logically that drought was a natural occurrence, that it had nothing to do with her deception, but the words still cut deep. When she returned to the ranch that day, she said nothing to Cole, but the weight of the gossip pressed on her chest like a stone. The whispers grew worse. Church people stopped sitting near them. Hattie Rose Caldwell remained loyal, but even she reported that others in town were saying cruel things. "They're just scared," Hattie said firmly. "When people are scared, they look for someone to blame. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to Clara. Every morning when she woke to another cloudless sky, she wondered if perhaps the gossips were right. Perhaps her deception had brought some kind of curse upon them. Perhaps she was poison to Cole's life to this land. One particularly brutal evening, after a day when 2 more cattle had died from the heat, Clara stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the parched landscape in shades of orange and red. Cole came up behind her, and she could feel the exhaustion radiating from him. "Maybe I should leave," Clara said quietly. Cole's hand on her shoulder stopped her words. "What?" "The town thinks I'm a curse," Clara said, her voice breaking. "They think the drought is punishment for our deception. Maybe if I went away, the rains would come." "That's superstitious nonsense," Cole said firmly, turning her to face him. "And I won't hear another word of it." But the whispers continued to spread, growing bolder. Someone painted a crude message on their barn door. "Send her back." Clara scrubbed it off before Cole could see it, but her hands shook as she worked. The breaking point came during the town meeting called to discuss water rationing and emergency measures. Cole and Clara sat near the back of the schoolhouse, and when it came time for people to voice concerns, Jacob Morrison, a rancher whose land bordered theirs, stood up. "I think we all know why this drought has been so severe," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The Remington place has been cursed from the start. They built their marriage on lies and deception, and now we're all paying the price." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Clara felt her face flame with shame, but before she could stand to defend herself or worse to agree to leave, Cole was on his feet. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "It's true, isn't it?" Morrison challenged. "She's not really Lydia Whitford. She deceived you, and—" "Her name is Clara," Cole interrupted, his voice ringing with authority. "Clara Remington, my wife. And yes, there was deception in how we came together. Deception I've known about almost from the beginning and chose to forgive because I saw in her something far more valuable than perfect honesty from the start. I saw courage." He stepped forward, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "You want to talk about curses? Let me tell you about curses. I came back from the war broken, barely able to function, with no hope for the future. My family was gone, my purpose was gone, and I was just going through the motions of living. That was my curse. Until Clara came." His voice softened slightly, but lost none of its intensity. "She didn't come here expecting luxury or ease. She came knowing she would be compared to someone more beautiful, knowing she was stepping into an impossible situation. And what did she do? She worked. She built. She created beauty where there was only emptiness. When the storm came and Eli Garrett was drowning, she risked her life without hesitation. She has been a true partner to me in every way that matters." He turned to look at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over each face. "You say she's cursed. Well, she's blessed. And I'm blessed to have her. This drought is not punishment from God. It's weather, plain and simple, and it has nothing to do with who I married or how we came together." The silence in the room was profound. Cole stood tall, his shoulders back, every inch of him radiating conviction. "I didn't marry a decoration," he said, his voice dropping but somehow becoming even more powerful. "I didn't marry someone to show off to my neighbors or to make my life easier. I married the woman who stood beside me in the storm, who has worked as hard as I have to keep our ranch alive, who has made my house a home. And if any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me directly. But you will not speak ill of my wife in my presence or anywhere else." Morrison sat down, looking deflated and slightly ashamed. Others in the room shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Cole's steady gaze. And then, from the side of the room, Hattie Rose Caldwell began to clap. Slowly, others joined in, until the applause filled the schoolhouse. When the meeting ended and they walked out into the warm night air, Clara found she was crying, though whether from relief or love or gratitude, she couldn't say. Cole took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and they stood together looking up at the star-filled sky. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "I meant every word. Cole said simply. As they drove home in the wagon, Clara leaned against Cole's shoulder, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The drought hadn't ended. Their struggles weren't over. But something important had shifted. Cole had stood before their community and claimed her, defended her, declared her value for all to hear. She was no longer someone's replacement, no longer a source of shame or doubt. She was Clara Remington, and she had been chosen, publicly and irrevocably, by the man she loved. That night, as they lay in bed with the windows open to catch any hint of a breeze, Clara took Cole's hand in the darkness. "I love you," she said simply. "And I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of what you said today." "You already are," Cole replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You already are." And though the drought continued for another month, though their struggles were far from over, they faced it together, united against whatever hardships might come. Because they had something stronger than luck or perfect circumstances. They had each other. And they had chosen to fight for that, no matter what the world might say. 3 weeks later the rains came. Not as a violent storm, but as a gentle, steady rain that lasted for 2 full days, soaking deep into the parched earth. Clara stood on the porch with her face turned up to the sky, letting the rain wash over her, and felt as though the land itself was offering forgiveness, blessing, and new beginning. And when Cole came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, both of them getting thoroughly soaked and not caring one bit, she knew that whatever storms might come in the future, literal or metaphorical, they would weather them together. Just as they always had. Just as they always would. The rains returned as I always believed they would, though there were dark weeks when I wondered if hope itself had dried up along with the land. But the earth knows how to breathe again, how to accept water and transform it into life. And so do we, Cole and I, in our own way. It has been a year now since I stepped off that train, trembling and uncertain, carrying a name that was not my own and a future I could not imagine. Sometimes I think about that girl, about how terrified she was, about how she prayed in the darkness of her narrow bed that she might somehow be enough. I want to reach back through time and tell her that everything will turn out better than she dares to dream. The ranch is thriving now. The cattle have multiplied, the pastures are green and full, and Cole has even hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. The house, once so empty and silent, now rings with life. We hosted Thanksgiving dinner last month, with Hattie Rose and her family, with Eli and his parents, with neighbors who have become true friends. The table was crowded and loud, and afterward, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes and felt such overwhelming gratitude that I had to stop and simply breathe. Eli visits sometimes, bringing wildflowers he picks from the meadow. He is 10 now, growing tall and strong, and he still calls me the brave lady, though I have told him 100 times to just call me Clara. He helps me in the garden, and I teach him the names of plants and how to coax life from stubborn soil. Last week, he told me he wants to be a rancher when he grows up, just like Mr. Remington. Cole ruffled his hair and looked pleased, and I saw in his eyes a glimpse of the father he might someday be. We have not yet been blessed with children of our own, but we do not lose hope. And in the meantime we have each other, and we have this life we have built together from broken pieces and brave choices. Cole takes my hand now without thinking about it, his calloused fingers closing around mine as naturally as breathing. We walk together in the evenings, after the work is done, out across the prairie to watch the sunset paint the world in gold and crimson. The land stretches endlessly around us, and the sky seems to go on forever, and I feel so small and yet so significant, a single thread in a vast and beautiful tapestry. "What are you thinking about?" Cole asked me last night as we stood together under the emerging stars. "About names," I told him. "About how I spent so many years hiding behind someone else's name, trying to be someone I wasn't. And now I have a name that feels real. Clara Remington. It's mine. I earned it." He pulled me closer, his arm solid around my shoulders. "You've earned everything," he said quietly. "Every bit of happiness, every moment of peace. You've worked for it, fought for it. You've made it real. I am no longer someone's replacement. I am no longer the plain sister, the overlooked daughter, the woman who was sent because the beautiful one wouldn't go. I am Clara Remington, woman of this land, keeper of this home, partner to this good man. I am exactly who I was always meant to be, though it took a train ride west and a season of storms to discover it. The stars shimmer above the Montana plains, thousands upon thousands of them, scattered across the darkness like seeds of light. Cole and I stand together beneath them, and I think about all the small moments that brought us here. The first morning I planted flowers by the porch. The night of the storm when we saved Eli together. The day I finally told him the truth, and he said he already knew. The moment in the town meeting when he stood before everyone and claimed me as his own. Each moment was a choice. Each choice was a step toward this life, this love, this home. Sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, I think about Lydia. I wonder if she is happy with whatever life she has found, if she ever thinks about the ranch in Montana and the man she never wanted. Hope she is well. I bear her no ill will, though her selfishness set me on this path. In fact, perhaps I should thank her, though I doubt I ever will. Her weakness gave me the opportunity to discover my own strength. The seasons turn here with a clarity I never knew in the city. Spring brings new calves and wildflowers that carpet the prairie in waves of color. Summer means long days of hard work and the satisfaction of watching things grow. Autumn paints the aspen groves gold and fills the air with the promise of change. And winter, though harsh, has its own severe beauty, the snow transforming the landscape into something pure and clean and new. We have learned to read the signs of the land, Cole and I. We can tell when a storm is coming by the way the horses behave, by the quality of the light, by the feel of the air on our skin. We know when to plant and when to harvest, when to move the cattle and when to let them rest. We have become part of this place, and it has become part of us. I keep a journal now, writing down the small details of our life. Not elegant prose like Lydia's letters once were, but honest accounts of real days. Today I planted tomatoes. Today Cole mended the fence by the north pasture. Today we laughed until we cried over something silly at dinner. Today I realized how completely happy I am. These are the words that matter. These are the truths worth recording. Last week, Cole surprised me with a gift. A beautiful leather-bound book with blank pages. For your writing, he said, almost shyly. I know you said you're not as good with words as Lydia, but that's not true. You write truth, and that's more valuable than any pretty phrase. I held the book to my chest and felt tears sting my eyes. To be seen, truly seen, for who you are and not compared to who you are not, that is perhaps the greatest gift love can give. We have our struggles still. There are hard days when the work seems endless, when money is tight, when I miss my mother though I cannot forgive what she and my father did to me. There are moments when Cole's war memories haunt him, when I find him standing alone in the dark, wrestling with ghosts I cannot see. There are times when I wake in the night and fear that somehow this happiness cannot last, that it will be taken away. But then morning comes as it always does. The sun rises over the eastern plains, spilling gold across the land, and Cole brings me coffee while I'm still in my nightgown. Or I find a new flower blooming in the garden, proof that life continues, that beauty persists. Or Eli comes running up the path with some treasure he wants to show us, his face alight with joy. And I remember that we have already survived the worst. We have weathered literal and metaphorical storms. We have faced down drought and gossip and the return of old lies. We have been tested and we have held firm. Whatever storms may come in the future, and surely there will be storms because that is the nature of life, we will bloom again. Together. Always together. Standing here now with Cole's hand in mine and the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient dance, I feel the truth of it settle deep in my bones. I'm home. Not just in this place though I love it. Not just in this house though I have made it beautiful, but in myself, in my own skin, in my own name. I am Clara Remington and I am enough, more than enough. I am exactly who I was meant to be. And when I turn to Cole, when I see the love shining in his eyes as he looks at me, when I feel the gentle pressure of his hand tightening around mine, I know that he sees it too. He sees me, all of me, the truth of me, and he has chosen that truth every single day. Ready to go inside? He asks softly. In a moment, I say, wanting to hold on to this perfect instant just a little longer. The night is cool but not cold, and the stars have never seemed brighter. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote calls, and another answers. The prairie sings its eternal song, and we are part of it now, Cole and I, threads woven into the fabric of this place. I love you, I tell him, though I have said it 1,000 times before and will say it 1,000 times again. I love you too, he replies, and I hear in his voice everything we have been through, everything we have built, everything we have yet to become. Then we turn together and walk back toward the house, toward the warm light spilling from the windows, toward the life we have made with our own hands and hearts. The stars continue their shimmer above us, and the earth breathes beneath our feet, and I walk beside this man knowing that whatever tomorrow brings, we will face it together. We will bloom again as we always have, as we always will. Between earth and starlight, between past and future, between who I was and who I have become, I have found my place. And it is here. It will always be here.